All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unravel what is, honestly, a truly fascinating mystery. Today, we're looking at the architecture of doubt. Specifically, we're going to explore how an established scientific consensus so frequently becomes the center of a fierce, highly publicized public debate. I mean, you see it everywhere today, right? From climate change to public health. But the origins of this phenomenon are much deeper and way more structured than you might think. So, who actually built it?
Well, we really have to start with this central paradox. If the science is settled, why on earth is there a debate? It's a question that historians of science, like Naomi Oreskes, have spent years trying to answer. Because, surprisingly often, foundational science is known and fully accepted by the expert community for literally decades before these sudden, incredibly polarizing arguments erupt in the public square. So what exactly flips the switch from a quiet scientific consensus to a loud, angry controversy?
Take a look at this number, 72%. Now, back in a 2007 poll conducted by Yale and Gallup, 72% of Americans were actually completely or mostly convinced that global warming was underway. Think about that, almost 3/4 of the country. There was a genuine, growing public consensus forming around the science. People generally got it. But then, that consensus was intentionally derailed. And to understand how that derailment happened, we've got to look at the actual timeline of the science itself.
Because, this science wasn't just invented yesterday. Look at how far back this goes. In the 1850s, John Tyndall discovers the concept of greenhouse gases. By 1938, Guy Stewart Callendar is already suggesting warming is underway. Fast forward to 1958, and Charles Keeling starts accurately measuring CO2 increases, which gives us the famous Keeling curve. And get this is mind-blowing. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson was officially warned about global-scale atmospheric alteration from burning fossil fuels. This drops us right into the middle of the mystery. If the President of the United States was formally warned in 1965, why in the world are we still arguing about it today?
That brings us to part 1, the blueprint, otherwise known as the tobacco strategy. To answer our mystery, we have to look at the original blueprint. Because the strategy to manufacture doubt, it didn't start with climate science or environmentalism at all. It started with cigarettes. Just listen to this dramatic 1969 tobacco industry memo. It literally says, doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. I mean, wow, that is the historical origin point right there in black and white. Doubt-mongering wasn't some organic accident. It was a deliberate, highly calculated corporate strategy designed specifically to stave off government regulation. So how did they do it? What were the specific tactics? Well, the tobacco industry realized pretty early on that they couldn't just have their own executives go on TV and deny the facts. Nobody would believe them, right? Instead, they had to recruit distinguished, prestigious scientists to systematically misrepresent the evidence for them. They cherry-picked isolated data points to confuse people. They launched vicious personal attacks on leading scientists to ruin their credibility. They heavily pressured journalists to provide quote-unquote balanced coverage, demanding equal airtime for fringe theories. And they vigorously promoted a tiny handful of dissenting scientists to create this grand illusion of a vibrant debate, when in reality, the actual scientific community was in total agreement.
Which leads us to part 2, Cold Warriors and Climate. So how exactly did these very specific tobacco tactics jump over to climate science? Well, fast forward to 1989. This is a moment of profound historical contingency. The Cold War is ending, the Berlin Wall is falling, the Soviet threat is disintegrating. And at the exact same time, a global environmental consensus is coalescing around major issues like the ozone hole and global warming. In 1989, these two stories merged. Distinguished Cold War weapons physicists, men like Fred Seitz, who, by the way, had previously consulted for R.J. Reynolds distributing millions to cast doubt on the harms of tobacco, and Bill Nierenberg, they adapted the tobacco strategy to attack environmental science. These were men who had spent their entire lives defending the free world against the Soviet Union, and suddenly they saw a brand new enemy.
And that new, perceived enemy was deeply tied to an ideology known as free market fundamentalism. This is an ideology asserting that civic freedom and free markets are completely inextricably linked. It's the belief that centralized regulation inevitably puts society on a slippery slope straight to socialism or tyranny. Now, historians point out something crucial here. These physicists didn't necessarily do this just for a paycheck. They did it because they genuinely, deeply feared that environmental regulation wasn't really about saving the planet. To them, it was a backdoor path to government control and a massive loss of personal liberty.
So what we have here is a massive collision course.
On one side, you have an ideological fear from think tanks like the Marshall Institute, who feared that government intervention for environmental issues was basically a rearguard attack on civic freedom. But on the other side, you have scientific reality. Researchers were discovering truly global problems, like acid rain, the ozone hole, and climate change that strictly required national or international regulatory cooperation to actually fix. It was the ultimate conflict, an ideology that rejected regulation, clashing head-on with a scientific reality that absolutely demanded it.
Let's move to part 3, the disinformation playbook.
Now, you need to know that these historical tactics haven't gone away at all. They've just been refined and evolved into a highly systematic corporate strategy known today as the disinformation playbook. According to researchers at the Union of Concerned Scientists, this playbook has 5 distinct steps used by various industries to deceive the public and block safeguards. Let's walk through them, because I promise you, once you see these steps, you'll start noticing them everywhere. They are the fake, the blitz, the diversion, the screen, and the fix.
Okay, step 1 is the fake. This is where industries literally conduct counterfeit science and try to pass it off as legitimate independent research. For example, fossil fuel companies spent nearly $40 million to downplay the cancer risks of the petrochemical benzene. Or consider Georgia Pacific launching a secret campaign to publish fake science hiding the terrible dangers of asbestos. It's all about intentionally polluting the scientific literature itself, so the general public just doesn't know what to believe anymore. Next up is the blitz. This happens when companies aggressively harass scientists who speak out with results that are, let's say, inconvenient for the industry's bottom line. They try to bury the information by actively threatening the researchers. A prime example here is the National Football League going after the reputation of the doctors who were studying the link between professional football and traumatic brain injuries. They were actively trying to intimidate those doctors into silence.
Step 3 is the diversion. Here, industries manufacture uncertainty about science, where little or absolutely no uncertainty actually exists. They do this by setting up these front groups with super innocent-sounding names to confuse the public. A great example of this is the Corn Refiners Association quietly funding public relations firms to sow disinformation about the health impacts of added sugar. It's a smokescreen, plain and simple.
Then we have step 4, the screen. This one is all about buying a halo of credibility. Corporations will forge financial alliances with academia or professional societies just to make their messaging look independent and trustworthy. For instance, Coca-Cola funding a university institute specifically designed to persuade people to focus their weight loss strategies entirely on exercise rather than calorie intake. It leverages the prestige of a university to screen a corporate agenda.
Finally, we reach step 5, the fix. This is the endgame. It's where companies manipulate government officials or processes to inappropriately influence policy. They use intense lobbying or the classic revolving door between industry and government to compromise federal agencies. Whether it's pressuring the FDA to downplay the risks of animal drugs or influencing the EPA to reverse bans on harmful pesticides, the ultimate goal is always to suppress regulations that would otherwise protect public health.
And that brings us to part 4, the real-world cost. So what is the actual real-world cost of this playbook? We've looked at the history of these Cold Warriors, we've mapped out the corporate strategy, but this manufactured delay has profound, tangible consequences that connect back directly to our daily lives. And it all comes down to understanding this vital economic concept, negative externalities. Put simply, these are unavoidable costs that fall on bystanders who don't even get to reap the benefits of the activities causing the problem. Now, free markets are incredible engines of innovation, absolutely, but they often require regulation to prevent these negative externalities. Global warming is arguably the ultimate historical example of this. Wealthy nations reap massive economic benefits from burning fossil fuels, while island nations and coastal communities are left to pay the devastating price of rising seas. It's like throwing your trash over the fence into your neighbor's yard and refusing to pay for the cleanup. And here's the really wild part, the profound historical irony of this entire situation. By fostering delay, by deploying these merchants of doubt to fight off regulation for decades, these groups have allowed the underlying crises to steadily, inevitably worsen. And as a result, they have made the very government intrusion they dreaded so much, the massive, sweeping trillion-dollar interventions that will now be needed to deal with climate catastrophes, much, much more likely.
I want to wrap up this explainer by leaving you with a really provocative thought from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He wrote, "Liberty for wolves means death to sheep." When we look at this architecture of doubt, the deep history of denial, and the very deliberate playbook used to confuse us, we have to ask ourselves a tough question. What is the balance?
How do we appropriately weigh the individual liberty of corporations to operate freely against the fundamental safety and survival of civil society? Thanks so much for joining me today, and I really hope this gives you a sharper, clearer lens to view the scientific debates happening around us every single day.